Well, thanks, John, for that warm introduction, although I'm not sure that I'm thanking you for reminding everybody that I needed a resit on commanding JTF 633. It is a great privilege to be included, though, in such distinguished company as we consider the lessons that we've learned from a decade of war in Iraq and Afghanistan. And as you've heard, my task this morning is to open a conversation about command and control. Now, on the face of it, that could be a bit of a dry discussion, particularly on the morning after the course party. But I'm hopeful that you'll stick with me because I know the people who are interested in the ADF are absolutely obsessed with command and control. In fact, we're a bit like lawyers. If you get three of us in one room, there'll be four different opinions about what the appropriate C2 arrangements are for any given operation. Now, why is that? Why are we so fascinated by issues of command and control? Well, I think first and foremost it's because the C2 arrangements set the tone for an operation. As David Petraeus used to say at US Central Command, if you get the C2 right, everything else will follow. What is for sure is that if you have bad C2 arrangements, they create ambiguities and frictions that distract commanders and consume their energy. After all, C2 structures are about power relationships, or as I like to put it, who gets to give the orders and who has to take them. So it's no surprise that Marcus and John wanted to include a discussion on C2 in this retrospective on Iraq and Afghanistan. Now, as you've heard, I'm a two-time JTF 633 commander, so my perspective is primarily through that lens. But of course, I've also served as the Chief of Staff at Headquarters Joint Operations Command. I've been the head of Military Strategic Commitments Division, and I've served as the Deputy Director of Operations at US Central Command. So I'll bring some flavour of those jobs to the discussion as well. I don't intend to belabour the reasons why National Command is so sensitive to Australians. You all know the background of our experience in 2 world wars. And I don't want to trace the full evolution of our higher command and control arrangements from the outset either. Others have done that much more elegantly elsewhere. Instead, I want to focus on our C2 arrangements as I found them in 2006 and 2012. And I'll begin by describing how we got to them, then sketch them in outline, and I'm afraid that will involve some wiring diagrams. I then want to talk about some of the critiques of our model before turning to some selected other issues that I grappled with on a day-to-day basis. Now, before we get started, let me just add one other point. And that is that I'm the national commander that Tony Rawlins was talking about yesterday. I was CJTF 633 for the bulk of OBGW2's tour. So the buck stops with Mick Crane. But I don't intend to respond to Tony in any detail today, and there are three reasons for that. First of all, I haven't prepared to focus on that very narrow slice of time, and my memory is not good enough to address the points that he made in the detail that they deserve. Second, there are a bunch of other points that I actually do want to make. And third, because Tony's not here to hear the response. So I'll leave the detail for another day, but I will touch on some of the issues that he raised in passing as we get to the relevant bit in my address. The only other point I'll make before starting is that I do have a little bit of a lurgy, so if the voice starts to go at the end, please forgive me. Time's short though, so let's get started. Well, as we've heard in the early days, Australia's involvement in the Middle East had its origins in the terrorist attack on 9/11, and in response to that we deployed ships to support the multinational interception force in the Persian Gulf, the Special Operations Task Group to Afghanistan, and a range of aircraft to different locations around the region. Operation Slipper, as it was known, was commanded by the Commander Australian Theatre, as he was then, Chris Ritchie. And his concept for the operation was endorsed by the CDF and the Strategic Command Group, and then he was largely left to get on and run it. We didn't deploy a Joint Task Force headquarters, but we did deploy an Australian National Commander, and that's him on the slide there, Ken Gillespie. He was based in Kuwait, where he was co-located with the US Land Component Commander and handy to the Air and Maritime Component Commanders. He reported to COMAS but did not himself exercise much control over the deployed Australian forces. Instead, on national matters, I think we heard this yesterday from Peter Jones, the commanders of the tactical elements reported directly to their respective Australian Theatre Component Commanders, that is, to the Maritime Special Forces and Air Component Commanders. They kept Gillespie informed so that he could veto Australian participation if that became necessary. And of course, on operational matters, they worked under the operational control of their respective US component commanders. The command arrangements for the 2003 Iraq War, Operation Falconer as we called it, had some similarities. The Australian National Commander, Brigadier Maury McNahon, was co-located in Qatar with the US Commander, Tommy Franks, and as in Slipper, McNahon reported to COMAST, who by then was Mark Bonza. Again, the several deployed task group commanders were placed under the operational control of the coalition component commanders. But this time they reported through McNahon on operational matters and to COMAST directly on technical and administrative matters. The big difference, though, was at the strategic level. First, for reasons of secrecy, Falconer was actually planned in Canberra by Strategic Operations Division, and Bonza was only brought into it quite late. And second, in addition to reporting to Bonza, McNahon also reported directly to CDF Cosgrove, who wanted a more direct connection with his commander in the field because of the rapid pace of operations. After the successful invasion of Iraq, Falconer came to an end and a new operation, Catalyst, began. While several units did return to Australia, the remaining force still contained a range of naval, land and air assets, and it was at this point that we formed the Joint Task Force headquarters to command them. The first commander of JDF 633, Air Commodore Graham Bentley, shown there on the slide, had operational control of all the Australian elements. He reported to COMAST, but he also retained a direct link to the CDF. In the period following the establishment of JTF 633, there were some seismic changes in the C2 arrangements at the strategic and operational levels. In 2004, Headquarters AST became Headquarters Joint Operations Command, COMAST became the Deputy Chief of Joint Operations, and the Vice Chief was double-hatted as the Chief of Joint Operations. At the same time, Strategic Operations Division was disestablished, and a small military strategic commitments rump was established at 1 Star to support CDF and VCDF in their operational roles. In 2007, we see the roles of CJOPS and VCDF split, so that for the first time, we have a 3 Star who's focused entirely on commanding operations on CDF's behalf. At about the same time, Headquarters JOC expanded considerably as it moved from Potts Point to Bungendore, and it absorbed the component headquarters. Importantly, as an outcome of the 2005 Wilson Review, Headquarters JOC also formally assumed responsibility for planning for both the strategic and the operational levels. And finally, the MSC branch was expanded to a small division headed by a 2-star HMSC. At the JTF level, though, the basic command and control construct remained remarkably stable for over a decade. The JTF commander exercised operational control over a number of task groups that were dispersed across the MEO, most of which worked under the operational control of coalition commanders. The CJDF also commanded a significant national logistics element, which was designed to reduce our impost on US resources. But there were, of course, a number of changes in the JTF over time. In 2006, in response to our growing commitment in Afghanistan, a Deputy National Commander was established there in Kabul, with Colonel Dick Stanhope as the first incumbent. In 2007, the rank of the JTF Commander was upgraded from 1 Star to 2 Star, and the rank of the Deputy in Afghanistan was later upgraded from 06 to 1 Star. Having moved to Baghdad at the end of the Iraq War, in late 2008, the JTF headquarters moved down the Gulf to the UAE. Now, a move was necessary because the UN mandate in Iraq was coming to an end, but that move also reflected the realisation that by then, the bulk of the Australian effort was actually in Afghanistan. At about the same time, the various air elements of the JTF were assigned to an air task group under a group captain, rather than reporting directly to the CJTF as they had previously done. And in 2011, the new CJOPS, Lieutenant General Ash Power, assigned units under operational command of the JTF commander rather than operational control, so that the CJTF could exercise that further delegation of authority rather than that being mandated directly from Headquarters JOC. By the time I arrived in the UAE to assume command in September 2012, the C2 was very well settled. And to facilitate the discussion, let's have a look at some of those wiring diagrams that I promised. This first slide shows the basic national command arrangements. At the top we see CJOPS exercising theatre command, with national and operational command delegated to me. In turn, I exercised national command of those units that were based in Afghanistan through my deputy in Kabul, Brigadier Peter Short, while those outside Afghanistan worked directly to me. Although I had the authority of both national and operational command, matters were not quite that simple. For a start, there were multiple chains of technical control operating from MEO-based units to a range of agencies in Australia on everything from special forces matters to airworthiness to my finances. In fact, some of the detachments were not even strictly working for me at all. For example, the Digger Works team at Tarrant Cout was an Army unit that was focused entirely on learning lessons about Army materiel, and I had no say in what it did. And in fact, early on in my time, there were a couple of occasions where what were on the face of it technical decisions were made by technical chains that actually turned out to have operational implications. So I learned pretty early on to insist that we needed to consult on technical matters before people just went away and did things. This next slide adds the OPCON and TACON linkages between Australian units and the various coalition headquarters. It's greatly simplified, of course, because there were multiple coalition headquarters and some of them had multiple linkages to Australian units. For example, our ship in the MEO, as we've heard yesterday, worked for CTF 150 on maritime security, CTF 151 on counter-piracy, and CTF 152 on Gulf security, with the C2 arrangements flicking backwards and forwards as the immediate requirement dictated. It's interesting to note on this slide that Peter Short exercised more than just national command on my behalf. When the Dutch left Oeruzgan in 2010, we began holding and interrogating prisoners for the first time in our own right. And given the obvious sensitivities, the Deputy Commander in Afghanistan was made responsible for the oversight of detention and interrogation operations, and the respective units were allocated OPCON to him. This final wiring diagram shows another critical element of the C2 architecture, and that's the liaison network that Peter Short and I operated. Peter worked all his contacts in Afghanistan assiduously, and he did a great job on my behalf in keeping his finger on the pulse for day-to-day type matters. That meant that I didn't have to visit Afghanistan as often as I might otherwise have had to, and it freed me to focus on relationships down in the Gulf and elsewhere. I called on the US Naval and Air Component commanders at least 3 times each during my tour to get their assessment of their operations, to check whether there were any issues for Australia, and of course to touch base with the Australians who were working in their respective headquarters. And working with the Australian heads of mission in the region, I called on representatives of the host governments on whose support we relied so heavily. And I'll come back to the ambassadors at the end. And there are a bunch of other engagements that I did outside Afghanistan itself. Now, Peter Lay had the advantage of seeing these slides ahead of time, and he said to me yesterday that if you were designing this from the start, if you had your druthers, you wouldn't build it like this. And certainly, despite its longevity, this C2 arrangement, which I've described for you, has been heavily critiqued over time. Most of the main concerns are in a scoping, summarised really, in a scoping study for a review of strategic command and control lessons that was done by Noetic Solutions in July 2013. That study claims there are, quote, very few JTF 633 fans in the ADF, unquote. And it found, quote, near uniform questioning of the JTF's role, size, location and function, unquote. JTF 633 was generally perceived, the study said, to be, quote, at best marginally contributory to the work people did, and was described variously as a self-licking ice cream, overly controlling, risk-averse, disruptive, and interfering, unquote. The study found that those consulted had several concerns. First, they felt that the appointment of a discrete national commander, rather than the role being assigned to a senior embedded officer, confused senior coalition officers and other coalition members. Second, they felt that this separation rendered the Australian National Commander just another visitor to the headquarters, who merely added to the staff workload. They felt that any perception of special influence or access was probably largely illusory. And finally, they felt that the connection between the various activities being conducted did not support the need for a JTF. In other words, that the various task groups were essentially conducting discrete tasks through different coalition chains of command. They argued that with the introduction of the various environmental directors general at JOC, that headquarters JOC had evolved beyond an integrated model, and that the task groups could have been commanded directly by headquarters JOC through these components, with the logistic and force support work being made a direct command unit of headquarters JOC, presumably through the J4. At the other end of the spectrum, another former JTF commander, Craig Orme, makes a quite different criticism. He believes that our C2 arrangements were not sufficiently strategic and that JTF 633 could have had an even wider role. He argues that we only have ever had a tactical vision for each operation and only came to understand the need for a MEO theatre architecture after some 15 years of operation. He makes the point that had we had such an architecture to tie the theatre together at the outset, the transition to new operations as conditions changed would have been much easier. He also argues that such an architecture could have included the minor operations, including in South Sudan, the Sinai and UNSO. And I guess after yesterday, we could now add another critique. And if I heard it right yesterday, I think it was that the national chain failed to articulate an intent and then to get out of the way. Now, the data for the Noetic study, which I've relied on heavily there, was developed by an email questionnaire to just 14 senior ADF and Department of Defence officers. The authors are quick to point out that their study makes no claim to being comprehensive, and based on the sample size, I think we'd have to agree. That means we need to be a bit careful in deciding what weight to give to such expressions as few fans in the ADF and near uniform questioning. That said, the people that were canvassed represent an impressive body of experience. The group included 2 former 633 commanders and 2 others who would go on to command it. It also included former senior embeds, former CJOPs and a former SOCOST, as well as senior Defence Headquarters and Headquarters JOC staff. Craig Orme's experience speaks for itself, and so does Tony Rawlins. So each of those critiques deserves to be examined in detail, and no doubt, as historians mull over the evidence in years to come, a clearer picture will emerge. Let me offer a few observations that might be included in their considerations. First, I agree that the idea of a discrete national commander did bemuse some coalition folks, but I never thought they were confused, and I never found it an insurmountable issue. Actually, some senior Americans rather liked our system because it was quite clear to them which officers were doing national tasking and which ones were engaged in coalition work. For my own part, I've always thought there were some pretty good reasons not to have an embedded officer as the senior national representative. Underlining that distinction between dedication to national tasks and coalition effort is one. Another is that, presumably, an embedded officer's embed duties are sufficient to fill his or her days in their own right, without loading the JTF responsibilities on top. I certainly found that was the case when I was an embedded officer at CENTCOM, and if it's not the case, then maybe somebody ought to be reviewing that embed position to see if it's still necessary. And I guess I'm really not sure that embedded officers can bring a sufficiently hard-headed national focus to the national command role. My experience over a decade suggests that embedded officers very quickly become institutionally captured by their coalition headquarters. And I was just telling CDF Barry some stories about that on the bus on the way out here. And that's as it should be, because after all, we want them to succeed. We want them to be the best coalition staff officer they can be, so that they can be seen as a loyal team member and doing well. That's all good for Australia's reputation. But that does sometimes make it difficult for them to prioritise between coalition and national interests. No doubt some of my senior colleagues will disagree, because they think that personally they had the capacity to balance both perspectives. I'm not convinced. I also agree that my visits to coalition headquarters did make some work for the coalition staffs, but I think that was pretty minimal. I was very conscious of the sensitivity to visits that was always being played to me by the embeds and by the national staff in Afghanistan. I don't know how my predecessors and successors managed it, but I always tried to time my visits appropriately, and I always made them low-key. I certainly wasn't interested in getting detailed briefs from the coalition staff. Instead, I was focused on engaging the commanders themselves, and those that were worth their salt as coalition commanders were always willing to give me their time. Of course, I also wanted to hear the views of our embedded staff on how the operation was going and whether their individual roles were still useful, and to talk to them about how they were going personally. And if that took up some of their time, I made no apology for that. As to whether we got any special access or influence by virtue of having a discrete national commander, I'm not sure that we ever made that claim. I think such special access and influences we had came from the United States experience of Australia as an ally and a partner. We came to the party when they asked us. We then tried not to ask too much of them in terms of support, and we always said which bit of the job we would do, and then we did it. And here, as an aside, I want to disagree with Jim Molan on his claim that we somehow needed Afghanistan to restore our reputation from Iraq up to 2007. I served with the US 3 times from 2006 on, twice closely as the National Commander and once embedded with them for 2 years at Central Command. And in that time, I heard not one whiff of dissatisfaction about how the Australians had done in Iraq. Now, sure, the Americans are unfailingly polite, but in that period of time, you would expect to hear something. And I think also that such a suggestion diminishes the brave contribution by thousands of Australians in Iraq in the time up to 2007. Not least those young men and women who bravely put their lives on the line in the sexy, disarming IEDs in Baghdad, and having the daylights mortared and rocketed out of them down in Basra with the Brits. So I think we've done our bit and more. And frankly, I think to suggest that we needed to recover that reputation in some way is disgraceful. I think a more interesting question, coming back to the script, is whether we had it right in having our national support infrastructure, including our headquarters and commander, based in the UAE from 2008, rather than, say, in Kabul. To me, the argument for the UAE was pretty compelling. From a security point of view, it was far superior to anywhere in Afghanistan, and not having it in Afghanistan meant that ISAF didn't need to worry about it. Also, having been based in Baghdad on my first tour, I found the UAE much more central, so that visiting all parts of the JTF and getting up and down the Gulf to see our partners and their host nations was a lot easier. Perhaps another variation would have been to appoint Peter Short as the National Commander in Afghanistan, working either to me as the Regional National Commander or direct back to CJOPS. I think Peter would argue that he could have done that and that in many ways it was the de facto situation anyway. And I know that Peter wasn't the only one to have that problem. Don Roach is in the audience and he had the same issue with John Cantwell back in 2010. I'll simply say that I think it's easy to make the case for that kind of arrangement than it is for double-hatting an embed, which to me is by far the least preferred option. The no need for a JTF critique is also interesting. Could we have done away with Headquarters JTF 633 altogether and run the entire operation through the JOC components and the J staff? Well, of course, anything is possible. And in fact, we do run some very small operations that way. Solania in the Pacific, for example. But I believe it would have been very difficult to do it through JOC and the components in the early days. in the MEO that is, because of JOC's limited capacity before the major expansion in 2007. Maybe the components could have run the operational task groups, but the JOC J4 certainly did not have the steam to run the national support operations with the staffing levels that it then had. And of course, the doctrine that we were moving towards at the time was the creation of an integrated headquarters JOC with no components. So moving towards that sort of approach would have been swimming against the prevailing philosophical tide. But several former JTF commanders have told me that even the more mature JOC J4 couldn't have done everything that Headquarters 633 did in providing a forward base for logistics support, managing the RSO&I, pooling and redistributing equipment, administering ROCL and those kind of things. All of those are very real functions and they relieve the load from task elements and from JOC itself. Beyond matters of capacity, there's also the question of whether we should have run the MEO directly through Headquarters JOC, even if we could have. In my view, the answer to that is no. Headquarters JOC is, after all, designed to run operations worldwide at the operational level. And the task of running groups, task elements directly would inevitably draw them down into the tactical. Perhaps you could make the case that that's a small price to pay to eliminate overlap and shorten command and control lines, but again, I'm not necessarily convinced. Now, regarding Craig's concern that we didn't take JTF 633 far enough, there's a big part of me that agrees. I was out in Baghdad in late 2008 trying to negotiate the new SOFA with Iraq. So I saw at first hand the disruption to Mike Hindmarsh's headquarters, as it was at the time, as they upped stakes and moved down the Gulf. And I've heard service chiefs lament the fact that we burnt our bridges in Kuwait and walked away from it when we were finished with it, only to have to rebuild those bridges when we needed it again. So there's a definite appeal to the idea of a solid foot on the ground with an enduring remit to manage the MEO on JOC's behalf. But I think such an idea quickly founders on the rocks of reality. Wish it otherwise as we may, all our operational commitments in the Middle East were developed incrementally and were therefore tactical in their focus. There was no sense, certainly not in the early days, of being engaged in a campaign in the MEO. And winning resources was like pulling teeth. Successive governments prescribed numbers for task elements to the individual soldier level. In such an environment, winning support for JTF headquarters with a more expansive mandate would, in my view, have been simply beyond the art of the possible. As to Tony Rawlin's concerns, for now, let me just say this. The task for the AMTG and the OBG was very clear, including the constraints that were around it. The fact that successive commanders and their soldiers may not have liked it is of interest, but not a lot of importance. The fact that this was not a free-flowing conventional war, where there was scope for the exercise of elan and freedom of action, requiring mission command and all that sort of stuff. I mean, that was the mission as it was. That's the way it was. I remember going with Ken Gillespie down to visit the Brit commander in Basra, and of course he wanted that very capable task group to come down to Basra to be engaged. The Brits were engaged in a very messy fight there, and they were losing a lot of squaddies. And after all, they've always been prepared to fight to the life of the last coalition member, the last colonial. But Ken was pretty clear in the response that he gave. He said to that two-star, we said that we would go and hold Mathana and Dekar, and that's what we're going to do. I think we need to be very careful not to forget that we've been done over in the past by people who've tried to do things, wanted us to do things to suit their national interests rather than our own, and we need to be careful about resisting that. Now, no doubt there'll be some in the audience who disagree with my response to those critiques, and that's okay. I think the important thing is that we air the points of disagreement so that future generations are at least aware of the pros and cons of the potential options. Let's leave the critiques there and touch briefly on some other issues. There are many, many that we could talk about, but time's pressing, so let's just focus on a few. First, let me touch on that issue of national caveats and the so-called red card. In any coalition, national caveats are a very sensitive issue. They're a significant factor for the coalition commander because they constrain his operations. General John Allen used to track them personally, and I recall one visit to Kabul in which he produced a matrix that was a pretty messy beast. But of course, from a contributing country's point of view, national caveats are critical to sustaining national will for the contribution. They're usually very finely calculated, and they balance the need to make the force useful with a very clear assessment of national appetite for risk. As I've alluded to, our history is replete with examples in which those we've fought with have asked us to do things that were not necessarily in our interests. And since we first invoked the idea of a national commander, standing up for those interests has been a key part of the role. Say what you like about Thomas Blamey, for example, but you can't fault his performance as a clear-headed national commander in the Middle East in 1941 and 1942. Now, while some might disagree, as a general statement, our caveats in the MEO in 2006, 2007 and 2012-13 were reasonably modest. The Australian forces assigned for tasking in Al-Mathana and Uruzgan were not to operate outside Al-Mathana and Uruzgan without explicit national approval. The ship could work with some task forces, but it couldn't work with others, and things of that ilk. I only ever really came close to pulling the national red card once. It was right at the beginning of my second tour in early October 2012, and oddly enough, it arose out of a NATO requirement, not an Australian one. It was not long after we'd suffered the tragedy of losing those 3 young soldiers to an attack by the treacherous Afghan Sergeant Hekmatullah. That attack precipitated a significant review of ISAF force protection protocols, and one of the outcomes was a requirement that 11 specified criteria had to be satisfied before a combined ISAF A&A patrol could be sent outside the wire, although the FOB commander could give a waiver on up to 3 of those criteria if he was satisfied that the risk had been adequately mitigated. At that point, the Americans were still leading in Uruzgan. And two nights in a row, the evening sitrep from our deputy, Ben James, advised that the US commander proposed to send a combined Australian-Afghan patrol out the next day on the basis that he'd waived 3 of the 11 criteria. On the first night, I called Ben and asked which of the criteria had been waived and on what basis this combined Team Uruzgan commander felt that the associated risks had been mitigated. An explanation followed, and I thanked Ben and let it go. But when the same thing happened the following night, again initially without an explanation, I called Ben again to express my concern. I don't recall exactly what I said, but it was words to the effect that as the Australian National Commander, I was becoming uneasy about what looked to be a routine acceptance of additional risk for Australian soldiers that seemed to circumvent Commander ISAF's intent. Ben took it on the chin, and from then on, a thorough justification accompanied every proposal to send out a combined patrol. And as things turned out, it wasn't too long before ISAF set aside the requirement to satisfy the criteria in that particular way, and the risk was managed differently. But from a perception point of view, the damage had been done. When I went down to visit Uruzgan a few weeks later, there was still an undercurrent of concern about my meddling in operational matters. And in fact, the RC South commander subsequently raised it obliquely during a CJOPS visit. I think this incident just does serve to illustrate how important but how sensitive the role of a national commander can be. These weren't even my rules, they were ISAF's. Yet what I thought were quite reasonable questions provoked a minor storm. That said, I just can't agree with Tony Rawlins that Mission Command says that at that stage I should just step back. We must never forget what has been done to us in the past, and we must always be ruthlessly concerned with our own national interests, and in particular, the safety and the lives of our soldiers. Anyway, it was certainly a little bit uncomfortable for me for a while, and in retrospect I realised that I'd gained just some tiny insight into how Blamey must have felt when he was arguing, as he did, for the relief of the 9th Division at Tobruk. I've talked about embeds, and I should mention briefly that their C2 is not straightforward. Certainly controlling them is not easy. Witness Jim Mullen. That's principally because most of our embeds work deep within a coalition chain. There's rarely direct Australian supervision, and they are, after all, Australians. They're outcome focused and they have a can-do attitude. But that can get them into strife. For example, when a one-star director of the Combined Air Operations Centre, based in Qatar, got in an American aircraft and went in a bombing mission over Afghanistan in 2007, it caused me some concerns. To this day, I don't know for sure whether he was within his personal directive and rules of engagement in doing that. But the point I made to him was that I would have minded less if he'd told me about it before he went. And that way, I could have been better postured to manage it if anything had gone wrong. Graham Bentley tells me that he first began the task of crafting directives to our embeds in 2003, and they've grown like Topsy since. The early ones were a bit light on, and if anything, the current versions are probably too prescriptive. But it's important that embeds do have a very clear left and right of arc. If you think that laissez-faire is a workable approach to managing them, just ask Rick Smith, Peter Cosgrove, and George O'Kane. You might get a different answer. I said earlier that I'd come back to ambassadors, so the final point I'll make is about the relationship between the JTF and Australia's diplomatic missions in the region. Our ambassadors in the Gulf were of course important in helping to ensure ongoing support for our presence in the countries where our forces were based. But the two key diplomats, at least to my eyes, were the heads of mission in Baghdad and Kabul. Of those I worked with, let me mention just one here to highlight a C2 issue. I first met His Excellency Mark Innes Brown in Baghdad in late 2006 when my predecessor Mick Moon introduced me to him as part of our takeover tour. Mark had been ambassador then since August. I don't recall the detail of what we talked about in that introduction, but I do recall that he had very red hair and a reputation for being pretty fiery to go with it. Soon afterwards, my senior operations officer walked into my office to advise that His Excellency had requested that we send some staff across to give him a brief on current operations. Now that seemed a little bit odd to me because after all, he actually had an attaché on his staff at that time, resident in the embassy. I asked whether we'd done such briefs before and I was told that we hadn't. So I consulted our operations order and my directive from CJOPS, and as I recall it, both of them were silent on any formal C2 relationship between the JTF and the embassy, other than that we were on the hook to provide them with certain logistic support. But clearly it was imperative that there be a relationship that ran deeper than just logistics. The JTF was a big focus for the ambassador in its own right, and beyond that, our activities had the capacity to impact on his broader work. And reciprocally, he had access to a range of information that lent context to what I was seeing going on in the coalition, and he could work to help to shape things in the diplomatic arena if I felt I needed that. In the end, though, I declined to provide staff to give Mark his brief. I felt that our headquarters was already busy enough doing its core tasks without adding jobs that we weren't resourced to do. But I did offer to go across to the embassy and give him a personal brief. And that's an offer that he accepted with some alacrity. That approach seemed to work for him, both in terms of meeting his information need and in terms of deepening our personal relationship. So I made the journey across to the Red Zone every fortnight or so for the remainder of my tour, combining the brief to the ambassador with visits to our embedded staff and calls on senior coalition officers. I should just add that in 2012, the formal arrangements between the JTF and the embassy in Kabul, or lack thereof, were broadly similar to those that I found in Baghdad in 2006, and we probably need to give that some more thought. As I said, there are plenty of other C2 issues that I could have talked about. Should we revisit the idea of a standing deployable JTF headquarters? How did 633 perform technically as a headquarters? And should we revisit our individual trickle flow reinforcement model? Why did Australia come to have its own campaign plan for Afghanistan? And how was that managed? How did we get to leading in Uruzgan province when we'd fought for so long not to? And so on. As I said to John Blaxland last night, there's probably a PhD thesis in all this somewhere, and who knows, maybe I might even have a go at it myself one day. Although, even framing a starting hypothesis would be tricky, much less getting to any conclusions. What I do know is that everybody's experience of C2 is different. If you're Paul Simon in the early days, your focus is on whether we should have had a properly organised standing national headquarters to get us started. If you're John Cantwell in 2010, you're worried about headquarters jock reaching past you into Afghanistan, and you're also worried about the extent to which you yourself are having to lean into Afghanistan to feed the beast back in Canberra. If you're Craig Orme in 2014, you're concerned about how you ramp up again in Iraq when you've only just finished pulling the last bits of our military presence out of there. And of course, if you're Tony Rawlins in 2007, 2008, then you're worried about the fact that you don't have a job that you like and the extent to which the national chain is interfering in your business as you see it. So where you stand on our C2 arrangements very much depends upon where you sit. And on that rather unsatisfactory note, I'm going to finish, but I do hope that I've at least achieved my goal of opening up a conversation about C2. Thank you.